Welcome to Mystic Realms Recap. Links are in the description below. Please show some love of the author and me. On to the show. Everyone arrived at the gate of the mausoleum and landed on the steps in front. Rosen, who had been remaining silent, checked the gate and the surrounding environment. He did not mention anything about the place being safe, and instead remained silent. Rosen refused to believe that Lin Li had really discovered the magic trap because of the cloud. He felt that Lin Li had long planned to make him embarrassed. Lin Li didn't care about Rosen's attitude. Instead, he looked up at the mausoleum's gate, which was even larger than the gates of the Felon Kingdom's capital. That reminded Lin Li of the Titan's shrine that he saw in the endless labyrinth back in the Sky Castle. Of course, it was completely different. The Titans were massive in size, and were as large as mountains. Hence, they were not inferior to the ancient WYRMS. How do we open this door? Anduin asked as he took out the key that was divided into two halves. He then stared at the door for a long time before finally finding a place to put his key at. He placed the two halves of the key together, and carefully inserted the key into the keyhole. No reaction? How can there be no reaction? Anduin grabbed the key and twisted it left and right before pulling it out and inserting it into the keyhole again. After a long while, there was still no response. Seeing that Anduin was hovering in the air, Rosen could not help but urge, "Anduin, what are you doing? Hurry and open the door. We don't have much time to waste here." Anduin landed on the ground helplessly and handed the key to Rosen. There's no response. No matter what I do, there aren't any changes at all. You'll know when you try it yourself. Upon hearing this, Rosen ignored everything else and immediately grabbed the key before flying into midair and tossing around like Anduin did. At last, he flew back onto the ground with a look of bewilderment. Aldwin and Macklin began to panic after seeing Rosen's reaction. Why? Can't it be opened? Is the key fake? Apart from the effort that they had put in to get the key, they had also been looking forward to exploring Osric's mausoleum. If everything were to be in vain, they'd definitely feel terrible. It can't be fake. This key was authenticated by the arbitrator. Maybe the way we used it was wrong. Rosen shook his head and carefully looked at the key in his hand, only to realize that there were no useful clues. There are no magic traps around here, right? Aldwin asked. After receiving a firm answer from Lin Li, he said to the mages, "Check the gate and the surroundings carefully to see if there is anything suspicious." Osric's mausoleum was on the other side of the gate. No one wanted to walk there, hence, they could only look at the gate and sigh. The 200-odd mages immediately separated from each other and hovered in the surroundings, where they carefully investigated everything. "Why don't we just bomb the gate open?" Anduin suggested after knocking on the gate with his staff. Bomb it? This gate was forged with Titan alloy, and there is also a Guru-level mageweth on this. Any attack will be reflected, and even a powerhouse of the sanctuary realm may not be able to break it, Rosen said with a look of disdain. The mages were looking around for clues, and the leaders discussed other ways to enter. They considered opening the door, blasting the walls, and digging a passage underground. However, their ideas were all turned down by one another. The light that was shrouding the mausoleum did not seem impressive, but Lin Li told everyone that the halo and the Sky Castle were similar. The sky of the Sky Castle could resist even the strong nether storm, let alone their spells. How could the formidable Osric have designed a mausoleum that was full of loopholes? Just as everyone felt like they had nowhere to go, all of a sudden, an archmage yelled with excitement, "Sir, there is a line of High Elf's text here, which seems to be the ancient type." What? What text? Anduin asked, and rushed forward to see a line of High Elf's text just above the gate as expected. However, as an authoritative figure in High Elf's research, Anduin found the High Elf's print to be rather strange. Although he was certain that it was the text of the High Elves, he could not seem to translate it. In fact, the legendary mages and archmages present were all rather learned in High Elf's print. After all, many powerful magic spells had chants that were in High Elf's print. However, even the authoritative Anduin, who was extremely knowledgeable about High Elf's print, could not translate those words, let alone the rest. It seems to be the ancient High Elf's print, which was the first generation of High Elf's print created by the High Elves after they emerged. Hence, no one really knows much about it. In fact, even the High Elves in the late Dark Age might not have known it. A voice suddenly came from behind everyone, and Lin Li turned around to see that it was a middle-aged mage who was talking. Before Lin Li even asked anything, Anduin had already sprung out and pulled the middle-aged mage back. Can you translate it? Since you know it is the language of the ancient High Elves, you should be able to translate it, Anduin said as he pointed at the line of words on the gate. Although he seemed rather calm on the surface, his tone was full of urgency. I'll try, said the middle-aged mage, who then nodded and observed the words carefully. He then slowly murmured, seal, mine, something, hibernation. It should be something along the lines of only with my seal will you be able to enter my hibernation's place. They finally found a clue, but it still wasn't very useful for everyone. What is the seal? Isn't it the key? If it's not the key, what would it be? Everyone was going crazy. What did Osric try to do? Since there was a key to the gate, why would there be a seal? Did that guy have an illegitimate son or something? The group began to make wild guesses, and even planned to send someone back to ask the arbitrator Megard about the seal. However, after hearing their discussion, Lin Li suddenly thought of an idea. I have a ring called Brand of Dusk, could it be what Osric is referring to? Back then, I managed to enter the Eternal Furnace because of this Brand of Dusk. Since the Eternal Furnace was constructed by Osric, this ring might really be the proof needed to enter Osric's mausoleum. Thinking of this, Lin Li interrupted everyone and asked Anduin for the key. After scrutinizing it, he found a groove in the key which seemed to be a spot for something to be placed there. Lin Li didn't hide his thoughts, and instead took off the ring on his hand and tried to fit it into the groove. He finally succeeded. With a soft sound, the key suddenly burst into a dazzling light, and when the light faded away, Lin Li found that the Brand of Dusk and the key had completely merged together. He could also clearly sense the strong wave of mana flowing through the key slowly. I didn't expect the seal to be in your hands, Anduin said with a smile of surprise. Even Rosen, who had been displeased with Lin Li, was filled with joy that poured out from his eyes. They were already so close to the mausoleum, and none of them would be willing to return empty-handed. Most importantly, the item that the Supreme Council wanted was very likely to be in the mausoleum. If they could not obtain it, it would be a huge impact to the Supreme Council's plans. I'm not sure yet. I'll try it. Lin Li then inserted the key that had been fused with Brand of Dusk into the keyhole, carefully. Then, a powerful wave of mana was emitted from the gate, causing them to retreat while the thick and heavy gate opened. Looking at the door that was slowly opening, joy was written all over their faces. It was as if the treasure in the mausoleum was right in front of them. Lin Li removed the key and placed it directly into the Ring of Endless Storm instead of returning it to Anduin. Although the door opened, the key seemed to be useless. However, it was fused with his Brand of Dusk, and he had no idea if it could be removed, while the Brand of Dusk was the key to opening the Eternal Furnace. In fact, at this time everyone was already considering all the problems in the mausoleum. Even Rosen, who often picked on Lin Li, did not ask for the key back. After Lin Li came over, neither Anduin nor Rosen mentioned the key. Since the door was already opened, there was no use for the key. To them, leaving the door unlocked when leaving wasn't a matter for concern. After the door was fully opened, everyone got into formation and slowly walked towards the door of the mausoleum. However, they did not expect to be greeted with the sight of a boundless mausoleum. Although Lin Li and the rest had the maps of Osric's mausoleum, the maps were all extremely complicated, and the instructions were like tongue twisters. Before entering the mausoleum, everyone knew that they would pass a graveyard, but they did not expect its scale to be so massive. The large tombs were like hills that were blocking their vision, and even the legendary powerhouses could not see the end of the graveyard whilst in the air. The entire land was endlessly covered in huge tombs. It was practically a world of tombs, and not just a cemetery. This world was full of dense, substantial death aura. Even the one in the Shadow Glen could not compare to it. The only place that Lin Li could think of which could compare to this place was the psychic array of the Sky Castle. As the gate opened, it seemed that wind had blown into the world of tombs that was filled with death aura, which in turn began to surge violently. Sensing the changes in the death aura, everyone was shocked. It was obvious that tomb was not for one to rest in peace. Indeed, everyone soon saw that there were countless arms extending from the mud which suddenly became looser beneath their feet. Undead creatures then began to climb out of the mud. Even though Lin Li was once besieged by countless undead creatures in the Sky Castle, he could not help but feel a numbing sensation when he saw the scene in front of him. The tide of death summoned plenty of undead creatures from the world of the undead. However, the undead creatures here seemed to have been buried in the graveyard, and Lin Li was certain that all of them had once been living beings. Although the level 20 offensive spells were not that powerful, they were enough to deal with the level 15 demons. Under the support of Anduin's huge mental strength, the range of magic was expanded by several times, and all the demons were shrouded in the attacking range of the lightning. Lin Li looked at Anduin, who had cast the spell, and began to get a clearer idea of his abilities. Although they were both level 23, there was still a difference in their mastery of nomological power, mental strength, and mana. However, Lin Li could tell that his abilities were rather similar to his at the moment. In just a few seconds, the originally beautiful moonstone pavement was already covered in the blood of the abyssal demons. The dense lightning was like a huge meat grinder, destroying the corpses of the abyssal demons and smashing them into bits. It caused the entire square to be elevated by one floor. Fortunately, the mages' mentalities were good. Ordinary people would probably die. Anduin, you're thrilled, but what are we supposed to do? Aldwin complained jokingly. Fly over, I've already checked. Apart from the Gate of Doom, there are no other traps here in this square, Lin Li said with a wry smile. Fortunately, he had already studied everything there. Otherwise, he would not be able to see the traps at all by now. The Gate of Doom between the two giant pillars was closed as soon as the abyssal demons occupied the entire square, revealing the gate of the mausoleum that was not too far behind. The legendary mages, like Lin Li, flew towards the gate of the mausoleum, while the other mages slowed down a little and cast levitation spells to hover above the nauseating bloody corpses. Lin Li knew about Osric being labeled as a butcher since a long time ago, and he had also heard from Kanoris that Osric had used 100,000 souls to create the ghosts that were occupying the Sky Castle. Nonetheless, it was all based on hearsay, and the so-called 100,000 souls was just a number to him. However, there were countless undead creatures that had crawled out here and exhibited Osric's characteristic as a butcher. If they wanted to go deeper into the mausoleum, the battle would definitely be inevitable as the endless undead creatures were pouring in like a tide. The skeletal warriors were raising their swords up to the sky, while hellfire bombs were darting from all directions, drowning everyone in the sea of undead in the blink of an eye. No, these undead creatures seem to be different, Aldwin said to the mages, before turning around to speak to the others around him. These undead creatures are too agile, and they even dodge individual magic spells. Upon hearing Aldwin's words, everyone carefully observed the surrounding undead creatures, especially the skeletal warriors, which had rushed forth to act as shields. The skeletal warriors had always been the ones to sacrifice themselves for the undead creatures, and they were extremely weak, possessing no intelligence. All they knew to do was to charge forward according to the commands they received. Besides, even their so-called charging was extremely slow as well, just as if they would fall apart anytime soon. However, the skeletal warriors that were now dashing at the mages were all tall, burly, and much faster than the average skeletal warriors. That alone was enough to prove that they were significantly stronger, but not enough to prove that they were different. However, everyone was surprised to find that the skeletal warriors were slippery when facing the magic attacks, just like what Aldwin said. Besides, the skeletal warriors that rushed to the front were not just capable of slashing with the iron swords they wielded, they were also good at using simple combat techniques. That was simply unimaginable. If skeletal warriors could use combat techniques, what amazing strength would the more advanced undead creatures show? Indeed, those undead creatures were very different, because they were not simply undead creatures. When the undead creatures crawled out of the mud, Lin Li had already seen the difference between them. He had also quickly thought of an amazing possibility. Although the undead creatures were still in their undead form, they were in essence monsters created by the combination of necromagic and alchemy. Although alchemy's level had fallen in Amril, it was still a very powerful profession in the Endless World where alchemists were rampant. During his adventure in the Endless World, Lin Li came in contact with many alchemists in order to collect unique alchemy formulas. He also headed to the gloomy dark valley to look for the darkness alchemist who was almost a divine smith. At that time, Lin Li had yet to obtain the debris of the stars and stars of fury, but he was already a top-ranked master in the Endless World. Equipped with excellent equipment, even the fact that the gloomy dark valley was one of the top 10 forbidden places in the Endless World did not stop him. However, when Lin Li went all the way to the depths of the gloomy dark valley where the legendary darkness alchemist was residing in, an undead army besieged him. Back then, he didn't know that alchemy could be used on undead creatures, and he simply thought that he had met an undead lord. However, after the battle, he discovered that the strength of those undead creatures was much superior to that of the ones he normally encountered. Even the skeletal warriors were no longer dimwits, and actually fought like real fighters. That battle really made Lin Li suffer a lot of losses. If he had not had the items needed by the darkness alchemist back then, his ending would have probably been extremely miserable. Lin Li also found out from the darkness alchemist about the perverted monsters. Unfortunately, he never got to obtain the alchemy formula. Lin Li had personally experienced the power of the alchemical undead as well as had some exchanges with the darkness alchemist. Hence, he understood the alchemical undead rather well. The undead creatures that had been strengthened by alchemy would be able to increase their combat power and abilities. On the other hand, they would also develop a stronger resistance to sanctuary power, and would not be easily defeated by a light spell. When Lin Li left the gloomy dark valley, the darkness alchemist was conducting an amazing experiment, claiming to be strengthening humorous WYRM using alchemy. The items that Lin Li brought with him were important materials required for the strengthening process, the alchemical undead. Lin Li stopped thinking about the past, and instead looked at the undead army outside. He then rubbed his eyes, and a look of desire formed in his gaze. If he could obtain the alchemy formula, he might be able to strengthen his Death Knights using alchemy. He believed that it would help increase the battle power of the Death Knights. Unfortunately, the alchemical undead were not formed by simply throwing undead creatures into the alchemy array, for the knowledge involved in this was related to a study of life. Although it couldn't be said that it was the creation of life, the alchemical undead would not be formed without such knowledge, an inanimate sculpture would be formed instead. Creating an alchemical undead was only possible for a real guru-level alchemist. Even Lin Li dared not try till now, because the consequences would be dire if he were to fail. The lunatic Osric was probably the only one who would dare to do it. However, Osric had to be somewhat confident since he had the audacity to create the alchemical undead. After all, no one knew what kind of extraordinary techniques there might have been in the immortal king's laboratory. When Osric plundered the laboratory, he might have found some alchemy formulas. Besides, Osric also had the eternal furnace which he used to create the ghost that was occupying the sky castle, forming it using 100,000 souls. Lin Li wondered if the alchemical undead had anything to do with the eternal furnace. After all, Kanoris mentioned that Osric created the eternal furnace for the sake of creating a new body for himself in addition to trying to replicate the sky castles. Facing the tremendous pressure brought by the alchemical undead, the mages gradually seemed to be overwhelmed. Although the vast majority of the undead army were skeletal warriors, each skeletal warrior had power close to level 10, and also had battle abilities. Every mage could clearly feel that they were facing a formidable army. Even several legendary powerhouses joined the battle at this time. Rosen and Anduin guarded their respective teams, and continuously bombarded the undead army with powerful legendary magic, causing numerous undead creatures to be blasted into bits. However, the two legendary powerhouses were not in the least bit relieved or relaxed, because the power of the undead creatures had completely exceeded their imagination. The only person in the team who was idling about was the young mage Lin Li. Despite seeing the tension rising, he still didn't intend to intervene. "Felix, don't forget your identity. You are also a member of the Guild of Magic. We're not in the Haiga mountain range now, and the people around you are not your associates, but your companions." Rosen shouted angrily as he cast his spell. It seemed that the news of Lin Li loafing and idling about while reaping benefits in the Haiga mountain range had already spread to the Supreme Council. "Felix, have you thought of any solution?" asked Anduin, who was also anxious, but did not suspect that Lin Li had any ill intentions. He did have a solution, which was rather simple too, but the key was whether or not they could find that item. Lin Li stroked his chin and looked back and forth. The alchemical undead had already been supplemented with alchemy elements, hence, they were no longer controlled by necromagic. Just like the alchemy puppets that Lin Li had obtained, the alchemy center was the only thing that could control the alchemical undead. In order to deal with them, annihilation would be one solution, but the simpler one would be to look for the alchemy center and control them. "Stop attacking, switch to full defense, and keep it up. The problem will be solved soon," Lin Li said to the anxious Aldwin before flying up into the air and looking around the cemetery. He then released his immense mental strength and continued to spread it out while carefully sensing the mana fluctuations in this space. "Don't listen to him. Once we lose initiative, we will be doomed." Rosen refused to believe that Lin Li could really solve the current situation. If they were to stop, they would indeed be able to defend for a while, but it would be hard to attack again. Aldwin was feeling conflicted because it was akin to putting the entire team of mages at stake. Listen to him, since he said there is a way, that must be the case. Although Anduin did not know what Lin Li had in mind, he did not doubt him at all. Everyone thought that Anduin had been raising Lin Li ever since he'd been a child, but no one knew that he'd only known Lin Li for 3 years. Besides, when he'd first met Lin Li, the latter knew nothing about magic. Yet he managed to achieve such great accomplishments within a short period of time. Aldwin looked at Lin Li, who was in the air, and then thought about the rumors about the Haiga mountain range. At last, he clenched his jaw and ordered the mages to give up on counterattacking and turn to full defense. The surrounding magic suddenly stopped, and Rosen angrily yelled at Aldwin, "What are you doing? Do you want to lose this group of mages? Don't forget, this doesn't just concern your Alana Guild of Magic." However, at this time, Lin Li had captured the special fluctuations emanating from the alchemy center to the alchemical undead. He immediately walked past the undead army and flew towards the huge tomb in the center of the cemetery. Everyone watched Lin Li leave and fall onto a tomb, unsure of what he was doing. The formidable undead creatures around him suddenly stopped, and silence was restored in the graveyard. "Kid, what the heck have you done? Why have all the undead creatures stopped moving?" Anduin asked excitedly as he smacked Lin Li on his shoulder after he returned with the item. Lin Li shook the alchemy center in his hand while giving new instructions to alchemical undead, and explained to Anduin, "You know alchemy. These undead creatures are not ordinary undead creatures, but were made using a combination of necromagic and alchemy." He then briefly mentioned the relationship between the alchemical undead and the alchemy center. "So, these undead are now listening to you?" Anduin asked when he noticed that the alchemical undead around him were slowly retreating. He couldn't believe his eyes at all, and was overwhelmed with joy. He thought, "This kid is full of surprises." Not only did he improve tremendously in magic, he even convinced Old Grim and Balba with his achievements in pharmacy. He actually managed to win the half of the key from Al-Akir using a random weapon that he made. Lin Li nodded and directed the alchemical undead to form a neat row before advancing toward the other side of the cemetery. Upon sight of this, even Aldwin and the rest were extremely surprised. With the alchemical undead in front of them, they would be much safer. "Mage Felix, you really do have some affinity with undead creatures. You already have 2 undead servants in the first place, and now you've managed to subdue so many undead creatures. Even a real necromancer will have to take his hat off to you, Rosen said with a sullen expression, sounding rather bitter. He had witnessed the strength of those undead creatures just now, and knew that they were 100 times stronger than ordinary undead creatures. Yet, they were now being controlled by Lin Li. That was absolutely surprising. While the undead army led the way, everyone followed slowly behind, and walked for about more than half an hour. Seeing that the death aura had disappeared without a trace, they finally felt relieved, and they could already see a long wall in front. Damn, how did Osric create such a huge mausoleum? It's probably larger than the Sky Castle. Although Lin Li had obtained the alchemical undead, he was not too happy. To him, the most important thing was the formula for creating the alchemical undead, and not an undead army. He wasn't planning to attack any cities, so there was no need for such a massive army. What he needed was the formula for the alchemical undead so that he could strengthen his humorous WYRM and Death Knights. The rumors about the Higa mountain range expedition had actually spread widely as the Manhwa family and the elves had all spread the word about Lin Li and his subordinates reaping benefits and taking advantages all the way from the Green Dragon Cave to the Sky Castle. The main reason was because Elder Randy and the rest were very touched about Lin Li mustering the courage to sacrifice himself and save the elves at the end. Of course, although the elves and the Manhwa family knew that the rumors were true, they sounded rather unrealistic to the others. The mages here had also heard them, but they did not believe them at all. However, after everything that happened today, they vaguely began believing those exaggerated rumors. Everyone watched as the young mage Lin Li subdued the undead army effortlessly. Hence, the rumors were not exaggerated at all. The team finally stopped. According to the map, the high wall that was not too far in front could be regarded as the central area of the mausoleum. They reckoned that the hibernation place of Osric and his massive wealth should be behind the city wall. No one could deduce just how much wealth Osric had accumulated before his death, not even those who had studied the history of that period. They could only say that it was a massive number. Even the map of the mausoleum did not mention how much wealth was buried in the mausoleum. However, now that they were staring at the huge wall, everyone finally gained a new understanding of Osric's wealth, which was clearly far greater than what anyone could imagine. Everyone looked at the towering wall while being a little distracted, only to see that it was filled with magical crystal cannons produced by the Dwarf Kingdom. That was a massive amount of wealth that managed to shock even Anduin and Rosen, who were authoritative figures of the Supreme Council. Aldwin's and Macklin's eyes were glistening because the magical crystal cannons were worth hundreds of thousands of gold coins each, which meant that the grand total of the crystal cannons was definitely massive. Besides, if the crystal cannons were to be placed randomly on the Omniscient Tower, no one would dare to offend the Alana Guild of Magic at all. Lin Li touched the ring of endless storm on his finger and wished that he could stow all of the crystal cannons in the ring. The Tower of Dusk now had no shortage of mana. And although there were more than 20 magical crystal cannons installed, no one would turn down more of such easy and powerful weapons. Lin Li thought, if I were to put more cannons on every floor, the entire Tower of Dusk would be full of crystal cannons that will destroy even the powerhouses of the legendary realm. Everyone was still staring at the magical crystal cannons on the wall and daydreaming. All of a sudden, someone yelled, "Look at the muzzle, it seems to be accumulating energy." The cannons had already emitted a dazzling glare, and they were targeting the crowd thinking of moving the crystal cannons home. The alchemical undead that were still appearing extremely menacing just now were badly damaged. Although the alchemical undead were far more powerful than ordinary undead creatures, they could not resist the destructive power of the magic cannons. The surrounding magical crystal cannons had also begun to turn their muzzles while emitting bright rays of light. "Hurry up, defend all you can," Aldwin yelled. It would be impossible to run, and no one could beat the speed of light, not even the gods, let alone the archmages who had yet to enter the legendary realm. The 200-odd mages raised their staffs at the same time while chanting some spells. Finally, when the second shelling came, they put up a large elemental shield. A ray of light erupted in the air, shaking the elemental shield, which now seemed to be on the verge of breaking. Even with the legendary defensive spells, the mages might not be able to sustain their defense any second longer under the bombardment of the numerous magical crystal cannons. The magical crystal cannons were the most direct form of attack. They would compress mana to its limit, and then bombard the target directly without any additional magical attributes. However, their power was the most brilliant. The amount of power was determined by the amount of mana. It was so powerful that even legendary powerhouses could not resist it. Seeing that almost all of the muzzles of the magical crystal cannons had already turned towards them, Lin Li knew that there was no more time for him to hesitate any longer. If all the magical crystal cannons were to bombard them, their legendary elemental shield would be as fragile as glass under a hammer. Even the legendary powerhouses would have no choice but to die. "There's nothing we can do." "Destroy it," Lin Li exclaimed helplessly while using the alchemy center to control the alchemical undead. "Mage Felix, since you knew that you can't block those magic crystal cannons, why did you spread the undead creatures? Do you think that they are more important than the living mages?" Rosen hollered angrily after seeing that Lin Li had dispersed most of the alchemical undead. "Look for yourself," said Lin Li, who could not be bothered to answer his idiotic question. Some people just loved thinking that others were the same as them. Some of the mages were puzzled by Lin Li's approach, but when they looked at the city wall, they discovered that the muzzles that were initially aimed at them were now chasing the undead. There were only less than 20 magical crystal cannons facing them. However, even then, the power still could not be resisted by the mage's elemental shield, which would be broken within less than 20 seconds. At this moment, Lin Li had already flown into the air, actively evading the crystal cannons while rushing to the wall. Thinking of what Lin Li said before, everyone finally understood what he was trying to do. What they had to do now was to seize the opportunity and destroy the crystal cannons on the wall before the elemental shield got broken. Anduin sighed helplessly. The magical crystal cannons were definitely worth a fortune, but unfortunately, they could only be destroyed by them. Despite feeling helpless, time was running out, and there was no way they could think of other methods. No matter how valuable the magical crystal cannons were, they still meant less than the lives of humans did. Lin Li had flown to the city wall. After dodging the attack by one of the magical crystal cannons, he moved the Helios scepter forward and tried to shoot the legendary magical crystal. Damn it, Osric really is a lunatic. He actually placed so many magical crystal cannons in his own mausoleum. Does he play tower defense games out of boredom? The magical crystal cannons on the city wall were not placed without restrictions or protection, as they were also wrapped with metal shells that were engraved with defensive magewefts. They were undoubtedly strong magical crystal cannons that even Lin Li could not break, despite having the help of Anduin and Rosen. However, he only had less than 20 seconds, hence, he could not tear them apart, because there were way too many magical crystal cannons on the city wall. As Lin Li waved the Helios scepter, a massive thunderball slammed into one of the magical crystal cannons on the city wall. Thunderbolt magic was known for its incredibly powerful attacks, and after Lin Li obtained the debris of the stars Thunderbolt, he began to have a huge breakthrough in controlling it. That was one of the reasons he managed to reach the peak of level 23. Boom! A huge explosion sounded, and the magical crystal cannon that was engulfed by the thunderball could not resist even for a tenth of a second. Damn it, I must be faster, Lin Li thought as he stared at the ray of light blasting down the wall, continuously trying to decrease his casting time. After all, Lin Li could not cast spells immediately, hence, he had no choice but to reduce his casting time. 1 second for every legendary spell? That wasn't enough. Lin Li only had less than 20 seconds, and he had plenty of crystal cannons to destroy. He had to continue compressing while ensuring that his spells were cast successfully. If he were to fail, it would not only result in backfiring, he would also be wasting precious time. Lin Li felt like he had returned to the Sky Castle where he had to temporarily interrupt the psychic array and draw a total of 144 magewefts on 36 towers within 10 seconds. In addition to the time taken to draw the magewefts, he also needed time to travel. Back then, he was much more pressed for time than he was now. A huge thunderball landed on the magical crystal cannon. Lin Li had no time to look at the result at all. Instead, he continued to chant the spell for a while, before waving his staff. Behind Lin Li, the sounds of explosions continued to fill the air while pushing him forward. He could no longer see anything except the next magical crystal cannon that he had to destroy. Lin Li even compressed a legendary spell into a note that sounded extremely sharp to others, but that was not enough. The arrangement of the magical elements was also completed instantly with the support of huge spiritual power. The consequences were an overdraft for the output limit and his body instead of mental strength and mana. Although his mental strength and mana were almost infinite, Lin Li was already exhausted, and he had no choice but to persist by relying on his determination. Compared to Lin Li, who was racing against time, Anduin and Rosen seemed to be a little more relaxed. Although they were also facing the strong magical crystal cannons, the two of them who had long entered the legendary realm were using different approaches. With a wealth of experience, they already knew how much mana they had to exhaust on each crystal cannon after destroying the first one. Unlike Lin Li, they needed not use their full strength for each blow. Instead, they evenly distributed their mana and used low-level magic to achieve the right effect, which also allowed them to achieve the highest efficiency in casting time and usage of mental strength. The three legendary powerhouses each used their own methods to destroy the magical crystal cannons one by one. In just 10 seconds or so, the light emitted from the walls was rapidly reduced, and at this juncture, the mages no longer had to solely become targets. While maintaining the elemental shield, they continued to move towards the wall. Finally, when there were only a few magical crystal cannons left on the wall, the mages safely ascended the wall, and the magical crystal cannons that had yet to be destroyed also no longer gathered the light in their muzzles. Lin Li broke away from the state where he was pushing his limits, and sat on the top of the city wall while panting heavily and looking at the scene outside the city wall. At this moment, Lin Li felt a strong pain in his heart, and he was deeply anguished. The undead army that he was initially controlling was ordered to scatter and attract the attacks of the magical crystal cannons. In the end, the undead were wiped out completely within just 10 seconds. Although Lin Li did not quite care about the alchemical undead, he did not expect them to be destroyed so soon. "Felik, how's it going?" asked Anduin, who could tell from Lin Li's current state that he had put a big burden on his body when destroying the magical crystal cannons just now. The world-destroying Thunderball was a level 22 magic spell that was thrown out rapidly. Hence, he could imagine how much mana was required. Lin Li shook his head and stood up. "It's all right. Good that it didn't cause any delay. Since we've already entered, let's continue." Lin Li managed to push on because he had a strong body of a smithing guru. Another mage would probably have collapsed a long time ago. Lin Li could not be bothered to find out if the alchemical undead had been destroyed completely. Although the strength of the alchemical undead had been increased countless times, they were not quite useful in such circumstances. Everyone came down from the wall, and finally arrived at the center of the mausoleum. Compared to the other side of the wall, the place seemed completely different. A huge and gorgeous palace was erected majestically in the center of the square, and everything around it could only be described as brilliant, opulent, luxurious, and magnificent. There were vines being embossed on the gemstone pillars, and they could all feel a refreshing aura of nature. Even the moonstones laid on the ground were beautifully presented with a variety of exquisite images which seemed too previous to step on. On both sides of the square, there were also several trees carved using chrysoberyl, on which every branch and leaf seemed to be fluttering with the wind. All of the buildings they could see were lined with rainbow adamantine and reflecting dazzling rays of light. Everyone was stunned, and they stared blankly at everything in front of them. Who would believe that that was Osric's mausoleum? Even though they knew that the high elves liked luxury, and they had also excavated many ruins of high elves, they had never seen one that was as luxurious and extravagant as Osric's mausoleum. However, at this moment, before everyone could recover from the shock, a sudden and crisp sound of horses galloping rang in their ears. Everyone turned to look in the direction of the sound, only to see that it was actually a team of knights in armor, rushing towards the crowd with great menacing aura. Although the army of knights was riding nightmares like death knights, they were wearing glittering silver armor, and seemed to be exuding strong and pure holy aura as if they were the most devout followers of the brilliant shrine. Damn it, that bastard Rosario. Since when has he colluded with the High Lord? He actually sent his paladins to guard the mausoleum for Osric. Anduin hollered in anger when he saw the knights. The knights in silver armor did not stay behind, and instead raised their lances and began charging at the crowd. All of a sudden, they collided with everyone forcefully. The mages could only support the elemental shield for more than 10 seconds, despite the magical crystal cannons no longer being a threat. 1. However, there were numerous cracks under the attacks of the knights, and their shield seemed to be on the verge of breaking. Although the mages were rather capable, they obviously couldn't compete with the silver-armored knights. The legendary powerhouses like Lin Li had no choice but to take action again by attacking them and preventing them from teaming up to charge again. There were only 20 silver-armored knights, and they seemed to be outnumbered compared to Lin Li and the other intruders, but their average strength of about level 22 made them absolutely horrifying. The holy aura that they were giving out was pure, and gave them significant resistance to all sorts of elemental magic. Anduin said that the knights were sent by Rosario, which seemed like a joke to others, but no one could find a reason to refute it. That pure holy aura could be owned by anyone and not just the followers of the brilliant shrine. Faced with the charging silver-armored knights and the formidably substantial holy aura, everyone was doubting and wondering if the brilliant shrine was really involved with Osric right from the beginning. In order to avoid incurring too many losses, the several legendary powerhouses had no choice but to intervene and stop a few silver-armored knights each in order to disrupt their formation. However, Lin Li and Anduin looked at each other in dismay because they discovered that although the attacks of the silver-armored knights contained holy aura, their methods were very different from those of the paladins. Although the true paladins did not completely use theurgy like the bishops did, they would often use divine attacks. However, the silver-armored knights did not know how to use theurgy at all, and would simply add divine power to their attacks or defense. That would undoubtedly remind them of the Death Knights. But was this possible? Although the Death Knights were different from other undead creatures, they couldn't change the fact that they were undead creatures regardless of how special they might be. Divine power was also a basic nomological power of Anril, which no one could change. What a joke. Has that bastard Osric really become a god? Anduin waved the staff in his hand, and a legendary level 22 magic space spell seemed to have exploded and instantly hit a silver-armored knight who was opposite him. There was no explosive roar, but a crack began to gradually increase in size, revealing the body beneath the armor. At this moment, everyone was stunned. It was unbelievable. It turned out that there was a gilded skeleton beneath the silver full-body armor. What the hell did Osric do? Anduin swallowed hard, and watched everything that was taking place in front of him. It was beyond what he could imagine, and he wondered, can these silver-armored knights really be Death Knights manipulating divine power? Even the gods probably couldn't contradict the rules of Anril. Not only was Anduin stunned, Rosen, Aldwin, and the other mages were all beyond astonished. Although the mages had yet to reach the legendary realm, and they had yet to understand the nomological power of the world, they still knew how incredible everything was. However, after feeling shocked, Lin Li's gaze was gradually filled with a tinge of enlightenment. The eternal furnace that had been created by the lunatic Osric was the only thing that could defy the rules of Anril. No matter how different a Death Knight was from the other undead creatures, their soul fire was the root of their existence. The divine power had a powerful purification ability. Under divine power, soul fire would definitely be purified. Hence, even a low-level purge spell would cause damage to undead creatures. Without soul fire, undead creatures would just be like humans without souls. If Lin Li had yet to explore the Sky Castle, he would have never believed that the Eternal Furnace could create the silver-armored knights, despite owning the Eternal Furnace. However, he found out that Osric had almost emptied out the Immortal King's laboratory in the Sky Castle. Yet he did leave plenty of experimental information, which included miscellaneous alchemy formulas and amazing alchemy techniques. However, most of it were the experimental records of the Immortal King. Although most of the experimental records were incomplete, Lin Li was able to deduce that 99% of those experiments were not completed, and the degree of insanity involved was truly unbearable. It was no wonder that the High Lord Osric could become a disciple of the immortal king. They were simply two lunatics who were constantly trying to enter the realm of the gods, and were only getting crazier. In those experimental records, Lin Li once saw the immortal king's experimental theory of the adaptation and use of divine power by undead creatures. The specific experimental process was incomplete, but Lin Li didn't have the time to infer and draw conclusions. However, there was a section at the end that was similar to a kind of imagined text left behind by the immortal king. According to the vision of the immortal king, it would not be possible to make undead creatures possess divine power under the rules of Anrel. However, by creating a microcosm that was fully controlled by him, could he create the same elements that were present in Anrel, such as earth, fire, water, wind, light, darkness, and chaos, as well as space, time, justice, and evil. With all these elements, in theory, anyone who mastered the microcosm would be able to become the god of that microcosm and be in control of all the rules and regulation. Creation and destruction would be up to him too. The rule-defying fusion of divine power and undead creatures would then be made possible in the microcosm. It was no longer a magical domain, but an actual world that was similar to the divine kingdoms created by the gods. In their own kingdoms, the gods could arbitrarily set rules and create all kinds of things that otherwise couldn't exist. They could even create the people who believed in them. Regarding this miniature world, Lin Li did not find too many clues in the journal left behind by the immortal king, but he made some speculations about Osric building the eternal furnace with some intentions that were beyond just replicating the sky castle later during the conversation with Kanoris. Both Lin Li and Kanoris felt that there was a link between the eternal furnace and the world that the immortal king had envisioned. Faced with the silver-armored knights that had divine power, Lin Li further confirmed his guesses. Although everything was beyond human imagination, that was enough to make the people at the Brilliance Shrine go crazy. The Death Knights that were manipulating divine power were using their powerful and sharp attacks to prove their existence. If they were ordinary Death Knights, level 22 power would be enough for them to be deemed the formidable Retribution Knights. However, not only did they possess strong power, they also had pure holy aura, and were almost void of the weaknesses that the Death Knights should have. In Anrel, they might not be invincible, but they were definitely enough to ruin a strong kingdom. Even though Lin Li's team was comprised of 3 level 23 legendary mages and more than 200 archmages, it was not an easy feat for them to get rid of the 20 silver-armored knights within a short period of time. Besides, they also needed to pay a huge price for it. It was only a short battle, but the lifelike turquoise tree statues around the square that were all priceless in Anrel were ruthlessly destroyed during the battle. Under the violent attacks of the various forces, the beautiful pieces of artwork that served as pavement were also ruined beyond recognition. Any artist would definitely berate the destroyers of art without restraint. However, in the fierce battle, only 2 Death Knights who manipulated divine power were destroyed, while more than 10 mages were injured. All of a sudden, Rosen stopped attacking, and after supporting the large elemental shield, he slowly took out a peculiar-looking staff which had a top that resembled a 2-headed snake. It was also embellished with a large magical gemstone that was continuously emitting an eye-catching glow and breathtaking mana wave. Sensing the strange magical waves that were appearing around him, Lin Li glanced at Rosen while restraining one silver-armored knight. Rosen's peculiar staff reminded him of the slingshot he played with as a child. However, he had no idea what power the gemstone-embellished slingshot possessed. Next, Rosen ignored the cracks that appeared on the elemental shield, and slowly chanted a magic spell while the gemstone on the top of his staff began to shine brightly. The dazzling light engulfed him, and massive magical aura seemed to be surging outwards like tides. With a loud roar, Rosen's elemental shield finally broke and collapsed under the fierce attack of 3 Death Knights. However, they did not immediately attack Rosen, who no longer had the shield to protect him. Instead, they stopped and retreated as if they had felt an uncontrollable fear. With the end of the casting of the spell, the light that shrouded Rosen suddenly exploded and dazzled everyone's eyes. Even Lin Li had no choice but to close his eyes, which hurt because of the dazzling light. When he regained his vision, he found that the sky above everyone's head had been blocked by two huge shadows. The two shadows quickly magnified in front of everyone, and they soon saw their true appearance. It turned out to be a double-bodied WYRM that consisted of a golden dragon and a silver dragon. The color of the body of those two dragons was proof of their identity. It was definitely not the descendant of mixed genetics, but a pure ancient WYRM. Moreover, Lin Li knew that even amongst the ancient WYRMs, the golden and silver dragons had always been the most powerful ones. Although tens of thousands of years had passed since the prehistoric times, Lin Li had witnessed the evolution of Amril over 10 million years when he was in the Sky Castle. During the war between the ancient WYRM and the Titans, the golden and silver dragons left a very deep impression on him. The golden dragon had incredible defense that could even resist the destructiveness of the Titan dragon spear, as its huge body gave it power that was greater than the other WYRMs. A mere wag of its tail was enough to sweep a mountain clear, and its claws could easily tear the body of the Titans, making them truly invincible. The splendid golden dragon's breath that it spat out had the power to melt everything, including the sturdy Titan dragon spears. I think it means that shield spell had 50% of its power left. Compared to the strong golden dragon, the silver dragon was more like an assassin. Although its body was much larger than the present WYRMs, its speed was really like lightning. The fine and exquisite silver dragon scales made it almost immune to offensive spells. Although its defense was weaker than ordinary WYRMs, almost no one could beat it in speed. It could tear apart spacetime with its claws, and its breath could corrode everything. Almost all ancient WYRMs would have terrifying abilities and strength of the sanctuary realm after they reached adulthood, and the golden dragon and silver dragon could be considered to be almost invincible. They were top-level existences amongst the 5 dragon aspects, and were just like royalty. In fact, given the current situation, even a random sanctuary-level ancient WYRM would be strong enough to wipe out the Death Knights that were manipulating divine power. The golden dragon spat out a whiff of dragon's breath that engulfed the 4 Death Knights, causing them to turn into ashes before they could even do anything. The silver dragon then suddenly landed before appearing in the sky again, drawing a beautiful silver arc. The 2 Death Knights on the ground suddenly turned into dust. The silver-armored knights who were initially violent and menacing became fragile and weak under the siege of the 2 dragons, which caused their silver armor and golden bones to turn into ashes immediately. Even the pure divine power could not provide any protection for the 2 of them. Instead, it simply collapsed together with them and scattered without restraint. Staring at everything that was taking place in front of them, everyone could not help but feel horrified because of the domineering aura of the ancient WYRMs. Even Lin Li was slightly distracted. Despite having seen the war between the ancient WYRMs and the Titans, he still felt incredibly astonished. However, the battle between them was even more frightening than the one-sided massacre that was taking place now. However, at this moment, Lin Li suddenly raised the Helios scepter high in the air as his light and darkness domain was immediately exhibited, shrouding Death Knights. Next, a silver dragon appeared outside of Lin Li's light and darkness domain and seemed to be slightly stunned as it did not rush into the light and darkness domain immediately. Instead, it turned around and merged with the golden dragon in the sky. "Felix, what are you doing?" Rosen exclaimed in anger after seeing that Lin Li had snatched some Death Knights away from the silver dragon. Seeing the sudden change in Rosen's expression, Aldwin and Macklin frowned slightly. Although the silver-armored knights were powerful, the last ones could not bring about much change alone. In fact, everyone could tell that Rosen had been picking on Lin Li ever since he arrived in the Alana Guild of Magic. "Nothing, just collecting my battle gains," Lin Li answered, casually. The countless black and white silk threads then appeared from the light and darkness domain. If looked at closely, the magic symbols of the threads would be visible. Next, the black and white silk threads formed a huge net that shrouded the Death Knights. "Your battle gains? What a joke, don't forget your identity. This operation is led by the Supreme Council. You are not qualified to talk about battle gains, Rosen exclaimed. As one of the authoritative figures of the Supreme Council, he definitely commanded great respect because of his age, abilities, and identity. However, after entering this place, Lin Li actually talked back to him again and again, making him feel infuriated. Upon hearing Rosen's words, Lin Li didn't show much of a reaction. Instead, he watched the expressions of Macklin and Aldwin changing again and again. Lin Li was the president of the Breezy Plains Guild of Magic. If he was not qualified to talk about battle gains, what about the Alana Guild of Magic? Although the Guild of Magic was established under the auspices of the Supreme Council in the earlier days, things were different now. The Guild of Magic was only part of the Supreme Council in name. Aldwin painstakingly obtained the key to the mausoleum, but it was not purely to claim credit from the Supreme Council. He merely wanted to gain real benefits for his Guild of Magic. What rights do I have? Yeah, the Supreme Council found the location of the mausoleum and opened the immortal door, but you must know that without the other half of the key from Master Aldwin and the ring that I have, no one would have made it here. So, whoever gets their hands on the battle gains will get to keep them. Stop throwing your weight around, Lin Li said while placing the subdued Death Knights into his ring of endless storm, closed the light and darkness domain, and ignored the two WYRMs that were revolving above him. Actually, Rosen began to regret it as soon as he said those words. However, he did not regret nitpicking on Lin Li, and instead regretted including Aldwin and the rest in the moment of pique. However, after hearing Lin Li's words, Rosen obviously wouldn't explain anything, even though he wanted to clarify things with Aldwin. Is that so? Whoever gets the gains will keep them? Felix, don't think that everything is within your control, just because you have some abilities. Everything has just started and the road ahead is still long. Rosen barked with a sullen expression. Without realizing it, he had begun talking to Lin Li like the latter was his competitor on the same level, and not his junior. I don't need you to remind me that. You'd better put in more effort and pay more attention to your own disciple, Lin Li said in a hostile manner. It was not that he didn't know how to respect his elders, but rather that he was incredibly annoyed with Rosen, who threw his weight around just because he was much older. Besides, Rosen was extremely biased as well. Damn, this is the kid who taught Sendros a lesson when discussing pharmaceutics. Anduin thought to himself, gloating over Rosen's situation even though he did not say anything. He forgot that he, too, had also been taught a lesson by Lin Li when he asked the latter about pharmaceutics. Although Aldwin and Macklin were displeased with what Rosen said, the two dragons hovering in the sky left them with no choice but to stay alert. Any one of them would be able to destroy the mages. Seeing that Lin Li had kept the silver-armored knights, Macklin walked towards him worriedly and pointed at the sky while softly persuading, Felix, I know you're infuriated with him, but don't cause the situation to be too tense. Don't worry, the two dragons are not dogs. Rosen is not qualified to order them around, Lin Li said nonchalantly with a smile. Indeed, the two dragons were incredibly powerful to the extent of being unparalleled. Even though Lin Li had already pulled his trump cards, he didn't have much of a chance at defeating the WYRMs. However, Lin Li fell out with Rosen not because he was blinded by anger, but because he had seen through everything. As soon as Rosen took out the strange staff, Lin Li began to pay attention to every move of his. The spell seemed to be extremely long and was more like a prayer. Actually, Lin Li's mental strength was already at the sanctuary level, and after being tempered by the magical crystal that controlled the sky castle, his sensitivity to magical waves was far greater than everyone else's in the vicinity. As Rosen chanted the spell, Lin Li could clearly detect that Rosen did not emit mana that corresponded to the long spell. Almost all of the mana waves were from the staff. Hence, it was clear that the two dragons were not summoned by Rosen, but were instead from the special magic staff. The usual prayer was simply a prayer to the gods, and the two dragons only appeared because of Rosen's plea to the gods. Hence, it was obvious that he could not control them. They had faced just as much danger previously, be it with the countless magical crystal cannons or the alchemical undead. However, why did Rosen choose to wait until now to use his staff? If he could have overcome the difficulties with his own power when facing the magical crystal cannons, how about when they were faced with the alchemical undead? He couldn't have known that Lin Li had a solution right from the start. Hence, it was obvious that the staff that could summon the dragons of the sanctuary realm was not that simple to use or maneuver. Lin Li reckoned that there had to be some unknown restrictions. Everyone knew that there was no free lunch in this world. People would still have to provide their souls as offerings in order to summon demons, and these were sanctuary realm dragons, which definitely required a high price to summon. At the same time, it also showed that the staff did not belong to Rosen, and was likely to be one of the assets of the Supreme Council, and was only loaned to Rosen temporarily for this operation. There had never been a case of a master begging his subordinate to work for him. Besides, Rosen's current power and abilities were not sufficient for him to continue restraining the two dragons. If he was the owner of the staff, he would probably be devoured by the two dragons instead. Lin Li was able to allow the two dragons to hover in the sky above his head, mostly because he was clearly aware that though the golden dragon and silver dragon seemed to have sanctuary realm powers on the surface, they were not actual WYRMS. In this era, the ancient WYRMS that had once dominated the prehistoric times had long been forgotten by the people and drowned out in history, regardless of how horrifying their strength had been. However, Lin Li had once witnessed the evolution of Amrel in the Sky Castle, and thus knew a lot more about the strong ancient WYRMS. Although it all came from his imagination, his emotions were not compromised at all. It could be said that there wasn't a slightest difference between imagining it and witnessing it in person in real life. When Rosen had just summoned the two dragons, Lin Li was indeed shocked, but after carefully watching the battle between the two dragons and the silver-armored knights, he also discovered a problem. The two dragons were indeed powerful, but they did not exhibit their power to the greatest extent yet. This was not because the opponents were weak, but because the overall momentum was much different from the real golden and silver dragons. If the real golden dragon and silver dragon appeared, the silver-armored knights would have collapsed because of their domineering aura before they could even put up a fight. Moreover, with strong and pure mental strength, Lin Li could clearly feel that the two dragons lacked a little bit of vitality in their menace of the dragon. Not all living creatures would turn into undead creatures after their deaths. For example, ancient WYRMS with pure lineage were said to be able to condense into dragon's clout and return to the dragon graveyard in the chaos of time and space. Lin Li did not know what the state of the dragon's clout was, but he was sure that the two of them were not actual ancient WYRMS. Juresco, or perhaps the three arbitrators, had sealed and obtained the two ancient WYRMS from somewhere and managed to keep them in the staff using a peculiar method in hopes of using them to tide over a crisis. After all, it was also an extremely powerful weapon. The two dragons, which were in the sanctuary realm, could not be matched by ordinary powerhouses of the sanctuary realm. Be it the dragon's soul or the puppets, the sealers would definitely have to impose some restrictions lest they fought aimlessly after being released, or perhaps because someone with ulterior motives might make use of the two WYRMS to carry out a massacre. Indeed, when Lin Li put the last Death Knight into the Ring of Endless Storm, the two dragons that were hovering in the sky gradually became thinner, and eventually disappeared from the sky. However, Lin Li noticed a detail. With the disappearance of the two dragons, Rosen suddenly turned pale while holding on to the staff as if he had suffered some agony or pain. Summoning the two ancient WYRMS indeed came with a price. The corners of Lin Li's lips curled up slightly, revealing a faint smile. Summoning demons also required sacrificing souls, and summoning two dragons of the sanctuary realm would definitely require a high price. Why was Rosen so concerned about the Death Knights? Apart from the fact that he was picking on Lin Li, it could also be because the Death Knights were one of the elements he had to sacrifice to summon the two WYRMS. Since Lin Li took away the Death Knights, the two dragons would naturally make the summoner make up for the loss according to the summoning agreement. Although the power of a level 22 Death Knight would not affect Rosen much, it was definitely not too pleasant. Actually, the author is pretty vague, so it's hard to tell whether it's one or more of them. It's also possible he took more than one, but it's one particular knight that was the problem later, but we will stick to plural. If you're enjoying my content, please consider donating a coffee or checking out my shirts on TeePublic. Although the two dragons had directly killed the silver-armored knights, the mages were incredibly exhausted after having to deal with the alchemical undead, followed by the continuous bombardment of the magical crystal cannons. Everyone knew that the closer they were to the mausoleum, the greater the danger that they would face. Hence, they decided to take this opportunity to repair the square. To everyone's surprise, the underground world would actually change from day to night too. At this moment, it happened to be nighttime soon. However, the dispute between Lin Li and Rosen made the atmosphere in the team seem much more subtle than it originally was. The two had already fallen out, hence, they naturally wouldn't patch things up and work together again as if nothing had happened. On Lin Li's side, Anduin, Aldwin, Macklin and the other mages had formed a group, but Rosen was not alone either, as 50-odd mages stood on his side with no consideration for the rest. Seeing such a situation, Aldwin's face grew even more sullen, while Macklin mumbled incessantly. The mages were the pillar of the Alana Guild of Magic, and they usually only followed the commands of their president, Aldwin. However, Aldwin had never expected that the 50-odd mages would stand on Rosen's side at this juncture. Of course, in theory, the Guild of Magic was subordinate to the Supreme Council, hence, the Guild of Magic would have lesser power and authority than the Supreme Council. Based on this, Aldwin could not criticize Rosen. Otherwise, he might get accused of opposing the Supreme Council, and that would leave him with no means to retort. He had no choice but to consider how he should rectify the problems in the Guild of Magic and solve them after leaving this place, lest his manpower got poached without his knowing the reason. Anduin had also seen the changes in the team. Seeing that Aldwin was gazing at him, Anduin waved his hands, and said, "Don't look at me. This is his personal conduct and has nothing to do with the Supreme Council." However, even an arbitrator could not say anything about it, because, in a way, Rosen was really correct. Seeing this situation, Lin Li shook his head and suddenly got reminded of a phrase: loyalty only exists because the price offered for betrayal is too low. All humans had desires, some wanted more money, some were after greater power, and some would betray their brothers for a woman. As long as one tried hard enough, they would be able to poach anyone. Of course, those circumstances had little to do with Lin Li, hence, he would not be worried about whether or not his mages of the Tower of Dusk would be poached. He was rather open-minded about such situations, and would let anyone go if they wanted to. However, he would also make them pay the price for causing harm to the interests of the Tower of Dusk. While taking a break, Lin Li stood in an empty spot beside the campground and released a Death Knight. Although he had vaguely guessed the origin of the Death Knights, the combination of the Death Knights and the divine power still made him feel extremely curious. To be honest, Lin Li still found it hard to imagine the idea of creating a microcosm that was put forward by the immortal king. He felt that it was unlikely for Osric to succeed since the immortal king had failed. The knight was exuding a holy aura and riding on the back of a nightmare, remaining motionless like a sculpture. The silver armor that was covering his body was decorated with elegant patterns, and looked extremely beautiful, exquisite, and lofty. Only through the gap of the faceplate could his light blue soul fire be seen. Its flickering was reminiscent of heartbeat. However, Lin Li could tell that the silver armor and the defensive mageweapons on it had nothing to do with the strangeness of the silver-armored knights. Moreover, if the pure silver armor possessed divine power, the undead creatures beneath the armor would definitely be burned into ashes. The nightmare beast that the knight was straddling was also exuding pure divine power that was not inferior to a legendary unicorn's. In particular, the unicorn's horn was like a silver spiral, and seemed to have been condensed with power that was incredibly pure. Its hooves were also covered in silvery white flames that seemed to be able to purify everything. This is simply an undead nemesis. Lin Li turned around twice, and took a deep breath. Had he not known what kind of body was wrapped under the silver armor, he wouldn't have been able to link the silver-armored knight and the detestable undead creatures together. Standing opposite the silver-armored knight, Lin Li closed his eyes and carefully channeled his mental strength towards the soul fire hidden behind the faceplate of the armor. The soul fire was the basis of most undead creatures. Although the Death Knight belonged to another series of undead creatures, it was still an undead creature, after all, and had to rely on soul fire to continue moving. The rules of Amril were such that the soul fire of undead creatures was definitely among the purification targets of divine power. However, Lin Li remembered that Osric had used the eternal furnace to create a strong ghost. Hence, he wondered if he had made any changes to the silver-armored knight's soul fire. However, after sensing carefully, Lin Li opened his eyes. The soul fire behind the silver-armored knight's faceplate seemed to be no different from that of the Death Knight. The only difference was that it was much stronger. After all, a level 22 silver-armored knight could be considered a retribution knight. Since the soul fires were the same, could the problem be with the skeleton? Lin Li lifted the armor of the silver-armored knight again, cut off a piece of bone from the end of the rib, and then placed some experimental equipment in the open space beside the knight. He then began to analyze the composition of the piece of bone. After trying various methods, Lin Li discovered a strange phenomenon. The piece of golden bone was resistant to flames, and purification by light was not only ineffective, but also absorbed by the bone. Obviously, it was not a simple bone. Osric had clearly added plenty of things into it. Lin Li touched his chin, put away all the experimental equipment on the ground, and then activated his own magical domain. However, this time, he decided to use the power of light to create a light domain to engulf the silver-armored knight. Soon, Lin Li discovered that the power of the silver-armored knight had been greatly improved in the light domain, and even had a tendency to hit level 23. That showed that the silver-armored knights were resistant to the outside world, or rather that the power of light that the silver-armored knights possessed should conform to the basic nomological power of Amril. It seems that the main problem is indeed in the body of the silver-armored knights, and not creating a microcosm to reenact the laws like the immortal king planned. In general, Death Knights did not have strong bodies, and their strength actually came from soul fire and the use of death energy. The bones of the silver-armored knight had turned golden, and they seemed to have high resistance to magic. They could even absorb power of light. However, Lin Li could not come up with a method of creation for a Death Knight that could use divine power without the rules of the microcosm. There was no longer an answer that could be obtained by research alone. It seemed that the eternal furnace had to be restored before he could find the real creation method. Lin Li put away the silver-armored knight and returned to the place where the team rested. He gave Anduin a brief explanation, and then began to meditate while waiting for sunrise. The night passed quickly, and the team was ready to go at dawn. Just like the night before, they split up into two teams. Alduin had no choice but to sigh secretly. For the sake of a smooth exploration, he could only try his best to tolerate it. The team passed through the ruined square and arrived at the gate again. Standing on the steps in front of the gate, Rosen took a quick glimpse at everyone. Ever since the conflict that happened yesterday, the relationship between Rosen and Lin Li was no longer reconcilable. Hence, when Rosen looked at Lin Li, he did not hide his hatred and disdain at all. Next, we are going to enter the central area of the mausoleum, which is the burial place of High Lord Osric. However, I hope that no one will take this lightly and think that there will be no more danger here. The dangers that might exist in here far exceed the imagination of each of you. Rosen turned to look at the mages below the stairs, and the solemn look on his face was restored. Anduin also looked much more dignified and solemn at this moment. He said in a low voice, "Back then, the High Lord Osric had 3 powerful warriors, Amatir, Angelano, and Aminos. I believe everyone is familiar with these 3 executioners. According to the data from our research, the disappearance of these 3 executioners occurred almost at the same time as the death of Osric. It is said that that happened for the purpose of protecting Osric after he was buried here. If the legend is true, then their current strength is probably close to the sanctuary realm." After hearing Anduin's words, the mages under the steps could not help but gasp in shock. Amatir, Angelano, and Aminos were significant figures in the history of the Dark Age. As Osric's most loyal warriors, the 3 high elves had killed plenty of people, and even once killed all of the creatures on a certain floor of the Sky Castle. Hence, just like their master, they were each called a butcher. Although the Dark Age had ended for more than 1,300 years, the names of the three executioners had not been forgotten by the people. However, after being surprised, the mages began to get a little excited. If they could kill the infamous executioners of the Dark Age, it would be a great honor that could not be obtained in this age. In particular, they were absolutely astonished by the real sanctuary-level power when they saw the two dragons summoned by Rosen. Lin Li shook his head slightly and looked at the expressions on the faces of the mages. He naturally knew where they got their confidence from, but had no choice but to secretly lament how ignorant they were. If the two dragons could be summoned randomly, this operation would not require the participation of the mages. Of course, the mages did not actually get too complacent. After all, they were also elites who had witnessed countless battles. Under Aldwin's command, the mages formed a tight defensive formation and walked through the spacious gate while keeping their guard up. To everyone's surprise, the cemetery still looked endless even though they were already in the central area of the mausoleum. There were no palaces or treasures. However, the graves in this cemetery were in the high elf style, and were extremely luxurious. Undoubtedly, only the high elves were allowed to be buried in those tombs. The team walked carefully for a while, but did not encounter any danger. As for the three legendary executioners, they were nowhere in sight. Finally, Rosen looked around at the lavish tombs around him, and suggested to Aldwin and Anduin that they split up to search. Anduin knew that although Rosen seemed to be discussing it with him, he already had an idea in mind. Besides, Rosen's main agenda was to ask Aldwin for some manpower, and not his opinion. Hence, he could not be bothered to say much, and simply told him not to separate the mages too far apart lest they got into an accident. Seeing that Rosen had gone to the other side to look around with the 50-odd mages, Aldwin smiled wryly and continued to explore the High Elves' tombs together with the remaining mages. Although the tombs of the High Elves were not as huge as the ones outside, they still contained plenty of treasures. Among the burial objects, there were some valuable treasures, exquisite works of art, and various magical items. After a long search, the team harvested a large number of precious items, but did not encounter any danger. The joy of harvest had already made them forget where they were, and all they could see were tombs that were significant enough to be called small treasures. Some people who were too engrossed in harvesting continued to stray further away from the crowd, and even Aldwin had let his guard down. Lin Li and Anduin were the only ones who seemed to be unmoved. They looked around alertly and did not take anything. However, as the sky gradually dimmed, a gloomy atmosphere gradually spread in the cemetery. Two excited mages exited from one of the tombs, each holding colorful magic items while talking to each other about the items they were holding. All of a sudden, one of the archmages stopped and dropped the items on the ground. His companion turned to look at him in bewilderment, only to see that there was a bull-sized hole in the chest of his companion, who immediately fell onto the ground. Seeing that his companion had died in a peculiar manner, the archmage immediately knew that the situation was turning awry, but before he could even warn the others, a slit was formed in his throat, and his head rolled onto the ground while his body collapsed silently. The two archmages died instantly. Unfortunately, they were too far apart from the others, hence, no one noticed the abnormalities here. Shortly after the death of the two mages, two other archmages at the other end of the cemetery also suffered the same horrifying fate. It wasn't until someone found the corpses of the archmages that they realized that their lives were in danger. A magical warning fireball rose into the sky, but the archmage who threw out the fireball released the scepter in his hand feebly as an ice spear penetrated his heart silently. However, everyone had already witnessed the scene, and they soon reported to Aldwin. It was a silent assassination, which was much smarter than any other assassination. Despite there being so many legendary powerhouses present, no one had found a single trace of the attacker. Everyone began to panic after finding out what happened. Assassin? Aldwin frowned, feeling distressed about the death of the archmages. However, the silent assassination of the enemy made him even more shocked and terrified. As a level 22 legendary mage, he did not feel the slightest fluctuation in mana at all. That meant that the enemy's means were clever. and that they would not know if they were attacked too. Aldwin was not alone. Lin Li, Andoin, and Rosen, the level 23 legendary mages, all had a good understanding of gnomological power, but even then no trace of the attacker was found by them, which only meant that the culprit had a better mastery of the laws than the three of them. Everyone stopped and watched their surroundings nervously. They had long dropped all of their treasures, and were gripping their staffs tightly to accumulate mana. The silent assassination was much more pressurizing and stressful than direct confrontation. Even though there would be more casualties during a real battle, it might not be able to affect the psychological states of the mages. However, the mere deaths of a few of their peers were enough to make them feel horrified and fearful. Usually, most people would refer to the advanced bandits who had progressed in their careers when mentioning assassins. They had more agile movements and could pull off sneaky stunts. However, when the assassins emerged and began launching lethal attacks on their targets in stealth mode, they would definitely leave some traces behind and produce abnormal energy fluctuations. Those would create opportunities for the mages to defend and even counterattack in time when dealing with assassins. However, the mages were now watching their companions dying and collapsing onto the ground without warning, and yet they could not see anyone or where the attacks were coming from at all. It was as if the assassin was transparent and unreal. The uncertainty was the root of their fear, and they would rather face a powerhouse of the sanctuary realm than an invisible enemy that they could not see through. Hurry up, don't bother about the treasures. Get everyone to gather together immediately, Lin Li said to Aldwin eagerly. Lin Li's tone did not make Aldwin feel uncomfortable, and the current situation did not allow him to have any other thoughts either. After being reminded by Lin Li, Aldwin waved the staff in his hand, and a huge magic symbol flashed in the sky, summoning the mages to gather quickly. The assassin really came and went without a trace, and just as the mages were gathering around Aldwin, one of the mages was suddenly beheaded, and his headless body took 2 steps away before collapsing. Several peers of his who were just as strong did not react until they saw the horrifying corpse on the ground. Aldwin clutched the staff in his hand tightly, and the joints of his fingers turned pale. However, he was unable to stop those things from happening, because even though his mage was attacked, he could not see a single trace of the assassin. The only thing he could do now was to wait for the mages to gather again. Finally, after 2 mages fell onto the ground, everyone turned towards Aldwin and looked at the 3 legendary mages, after which the fear in their eyes gradually receded. After all, the legendary powerhouses were like gods to the archmages. They believed that the coward who did nothing except launch sneak attacks would retreat in the presence of the legendary powerhouses. However, when everyone thought it was safe, a mage who was standing outside looked down at the hole in his chest, after which he slowly fell forwards onto his pier. Gather together, form a tight defense formation. Everyone, activate your magical shields. Lin Li yelled. No matter how clever the assassin might be, they would still need a certain space and medium to exhibit their stealth and assassination skills. If there was no space between them, the assassin would never be able to penetrate their ranks regardless of how stealthy he might be. Although its effectiveness was a little exaggerated, a condensed space would indeed reduce plenty of danger. However, the mages did not immediately respond to Lin Li's instructions, and instead shifted their attention to their president, Aldwin, who was standing in the middle. Regardless of the changes that had occurred, the mages obviously still trusted Aldwin's commands more. Now, everyone will follow President Felix's orders. His words are mine. Aldwin shot Lin Li an apologetic glance and gave him the right to command. Aldwin's instructions were very effective as the mages who heard his words immediately formed a tight defensive formation like Lin Li instructed. They began to activate their magical shields at the same time. Everyone, launch attacks at the surroundings, regardless of the target's location. Cover the surrounding space with magic attacks. Lin Li immediately issued a second command. This time, the mages no longer hesitated, and they all raised the crescent staffs in their hands one by one, releasing fireballs, ice rings, rapid ground spear, and all sorts of other aggressive offensive spells. Even a fly wouldn't escape their attacks. Lin Li believed that even an assassin with a high stealth ability would not be able to remove his body completely from this space. Even if he had blocked their visual and other human senses, his body would still have to exist in real space. After all, when he ceased to exist, he could no longer cause any harm to the people in this space. Even Juresco, the god of mages, couldn't launch instantaneous attacks when exhibiting Void of the Stars. If the invisible assassin could really switch between Void of the Stars and reality, he would be a true god. Therefore, Lin Li's method was also rather simple. By gathering closely together and casting a magic shield to prevent assassination while launching rapid attacks, they would be able to force the assassin to show himself. Indeed, Lin Li's method worked quickly. Outside the defensive formation, a dark and menacing shadow emerged abruptly, and rushed into the air like a black ray of lightning. Lin Li squinted and chased the figure in the sky. A thin figure wearing a robe appeared in front of him. The figure had long, straight blonde hair that cascaded down its back casually while the aftermath of the attacks lingered in the air. His bloodshot eyes and pale face seemed to be particularly noticeable, and the madness and tyranny in his gaze made everyone feel a cold chill down his spine. His pointed ears also revealed his identity. The handsome man with a somber expression had the appearance of a typical high elf. The high elf was wearing a black-collared robe and holding on to a thin staff. However, the red ruby on top of the staff was particularly large. Had they not seen it with their own eyes, they would have never imagined that a high elf disguised as a mage would actually possess such an incredible assassination skill. This is Aminos, one of the executioners belonging to Osric. He's known as the Mage Killer, said Rosen, who was the first to recognize who the figure was. Although Rosen was now a level 23 legendary mage, he knew that dozens of legendary mages had been killed by Aminos before the latter disappeared that year. Most of them were above level 23 too. Besides, Aminos' current strength was definitely nearing the sanctuary realm, hence, he would more so no longer have any advantage. Rosen secretly regretted his previous choice. He thought, had I known that I would encounter the mage killer Aminos, I wouldn't have used the staff to summon the dragons. I should have left that chance for now. No matter how shrewd Aminos is, he wouldn't have had the chance to take action. Although they had plenty of people, they did not pose any threat at all to the mage killer. At most, he would only have to attack them a few more times. When Rosen yelled Aminos' name, fear began to form in almost everyone's eyes, and even Anduin's face grew pale and sullen. It was because there were plenty of legends and tales about the Mage Killer. Aminos' nickname the Mage Killer was given to him officially by the High Lord Osric. It was because he was acting as an assassin despite being a mage, and also because he had killed plenty of rebellious mages viciously. As a mage, Aminos was extremely passionate about hiding in the dark and assassinating his enemy with a fatal blow. What brought him the most enjoyment was hiding in a corner and continuously creating terror in the enemy, watching the enemy collapse in endless fear, and finally launching a lethal blow. He rarely used legendary magic, and his favorites were Wind Blade, Ice Spear, and Space Eruption. Legend had it that Aminos got famous during the battle against the forces of resistance in the Felon Kingdom that took place when he just entered the legendary realm. The leader of the rebellion forces was a level 22 legendary mage who led more than 10 archmages who were nearing the legendary realm as well as hundreds of soldiers with various professions. During that battle, Aminos did not activate any high elf troops, but infiltrated the rebels' camp alone. He attacked them for 10 consecutive days with his level 20 abilities. During those 10 days, all the rebels were caught in endless fear, and the last few mages were so scared they lost their senses. Meanwhile, the level 22 legendary mage chanted a powerful, legendary magic spell, yet he was silently cut on the throat with a low-level wind blade. Even a legendary mage can't resist the attack of a wind blade. That was a legendary motto left by Aminos. Although the authenticity thereof was not verifiable, it did conform to his style. Some people also tried to continuously put up defensive magical shields to buy some time, but waiting for opportunities was the forte of assassins. They would kill their enemies instantly because no one could constantly shield themselves or ensure that nothing would go wrong for themselves. Seemingly having sensed the fear and terror in everyone's hearts, Amino smiled humbly and said, "Lowly humans, how dare you disturb Master while he's resting? You are all going to die today." When everyone heard the word die, everyone began shivering instinctively as if the temperature had suddenly gone below zero. A cold chill emerged from everyone's hearts and gradually surged through them to the deepest parts of their souls. "Continue casting, no one is allowed to stop," Lin Li yelled when he saw Amino's figure vanishing abruptly. Although Amino's strength was close to the sanctuary realm, even a legendary mage couldn't resist the attack of Wind Blade, just like what Amino said himself. In order to launch a sneak attack, Aminos would have to abandon all his magical equipment and not put up any magical defense. Otherwise, he would just be a moving target. Besides, without a magical shield, Aminos could be attacked and hurt even by low-level magic. One of the members from the team yelled as one of the archmages was shot in the chest by an ice spear when he stopped for a moment to reapply a magical shield for himself. That was the terrifying thing about Aminos. As a mage, he knew the duration as well as the casting interval of various magic spells. Besides, all of the weaknesses of the mages were known and exposed to him. He had the immense mental strength of a legendary mage, and he could sense every change in the magical wave of the target and capture all the opportunities that he could make use of. The death of the archmage was not meaningless. Instead, it was a wake-up call for everyone to keep fighting on and a reminder that they could never make a mistake if they want to live. Any negligence would give the terrifying mage killer a chance to kill them. It was a true battle for their own survival. Everyone went all out and released their greatest potential. Suddenly, the magic that was surging to the surroundings became a little more violent. A black ray of lightning suddenly burst out from the brilliant magical lights before turning towards the team in search for a new prey without stopping. "Don't relax, he might still be there," Lin Li shouted loudly. To him, such tricks were nothing new. Everyone had seen the 36 strategies in the world that he came from. After seeing the black ray of lightning that was the enemy's clone vanishing, the mages indeed felt a little relieved and relaxed a little, but fortunately Lin Li managed to remind them in time. They continued to cast spell after spell. As expected, Amino's figure appeared outside the range, covered by the offensive spells. Staring at Lin Li, who was standing in the middle and continuously giving commands to the mages, Amino smiled derisively. Then, his body flashed, and he disappeared again in plain sight before appearing on the other side, only to be forced into retreating by the endless attacks. "Felik, do you really think we'll be able to defeat Aminos by keeping this up? You're being too naive." Rosen's face began to grow sullen while watching the mages resist the attacks continuously. He did not wish for Lin Li to gain too much prestige amongst the mages through his commands. Of course, Rosen had also stated a fact. If they were to keep up with the defense, they might be able to sustain it for a day, but what would happen afterwards? After all, humans were not machines, and their defense would crumble eventually. Actually, Rosen was not alone in thinking so. Even Aldwin, Anduin, and the rest had all thought of that issue. However, they did not doubt the plan because they trusted Lin Li. When Lin Li was trapped in the chaos of time and space, Anduin actually made the effort to find out the whole process from him as he was much more meticulous than the rest. Due to the fact that he was Lin Li's teacher, neither Cheyenne nor the elves hid anything from him. Hence, Anduin knew better than the rest how amazingly Lin Li performed in the Sky Castle. The current situation seemed to be unsolvable, but Lin Li seemed rather confident about it. At the thought of everything that Cheyenne had said, Anduin decided to trust Lin Li blindly despite the doubts he had. Besides, so what if he didn't trust Lin Li? No one could come up with a better solution anyway. Is that so? Do you have a better idea? Let me guess, you're thinking of using some of them as a bait, right? Do you really think Aminos is an idiot? Lin Li retorted coldly with a sneer while giving commands to the mages. If you don't try it, how do you know it's not possible? Can you make Aminos admit defeat and give up using your method? Rosen retorted angrily. Lin Li waved his staff with a serious expression and covered himself with a magical shield. He then said to Rosen, "I'm not as generous as you to use someone's life as a bait. So what if we can only stall him for a few days? By then, your staff should be able to work." You. Rosen was a little speechless, especially when Lin Li mentioned the staff and reminded him of yesterday's events, which were definitely not a pleasant memory. Fortunately, the magic equipment worn by the mages was of top quality, the best in Amril. With the recovery abilities provided by the magical equipment, the mages would not suffer any depletion as long as they did not make any mistakes. After all, they were casting low-level magic, which would not consume much mana even if cast continuously. Looking at Lin Li, who was holding the Helios scepter and standing in the middle of the team, Aminos gritted his teeth angrily. No matter how much he tried to jeopardize their plans, the human mages seemed to often stabilize quickly under the command of Lin Li. It was not that Lin Li was good at commanding, but rather that no matter what tactics Aminos used, Lin Li would only respond by opening his magical shield and covering the surrounding area with magic. In the face of the endless magic attacks, Aminos did feel rather troubled. Although all of them were low-level magic, it was definitely terrible to suffer them because he could not use any defensive spells. However, if he were to give himself some defense, he would definitely be bombarded before he could even assassinate anyone. Aminos' figure was constantly surrounding the humans and lingering along the edge of the range of magic attacks, looking for opportunities to break through their shield. Unfortunately, the team of archmages was also one of the top forces in Amril, and had also experienced countless battles. Hence, it was unlikely for them to slip up. Seeing that the mage killer was stuck outside the magical shield, the mages began to see some hope, and the fear within them gradually vanished. It turned out that the legendary mage killer could be at a loss for what to do. Lin Li naturally also saw that Aminos was loitering outside. He exclaimed, "That's all the mage killer can offer. It's now our time to fight back, and we shall all cast a joint spell. Elemental Shield." Hearing this command, the mages who had already gotten used to Lin's commands immediately stopped without any objections. They raised their crescent staffs one by one, chanting the legendary Elemental Shield spell. However, Rosen, Aldwin, and Anduin were all taken aback by Lin Li's orders. What a joke. Enduring is already difficult as it is. Why does he want to retaliate now? That's the legendary mage killer. He's killed so many of us, how can we fight back? Felik, are you really sure? Anduin asked worriedly as he began to waver at this moment. Meanwhile, Aldwin wanted to stop him, but it was clearly too late. The mages were already at the last stage of casting, and Aminos had yet to take action. Hence, they thought that it might be a good chance for attacking. As the mages chanted the last syllable of the spell, Lin Li's staff emitted a dazzling ray of light that enveloped the entire team. However, as the light faded, the mages were surprised to find that the elemental shield that shrouded the entire team flickered a little like candlelight in the wind, and slowly began to dissipate. Casting failed. Everyone was filled with disbelief as they had practiced the spell countless times before. Yet, they failed. Aldwin looked at the dumbfounded mages and took a deep breath. Although they were still the same people, they were no longer standing as one team. At this moment, everyone immediately thought of the fact that since they had failed to cast the elemental shield, they were standing in front of the terrifying mage killer without any protection. What would happen to them? Everyone was stunned. The magic backlash brought by the failure of the spell was not that great, since everyone was sharing the burden. However, it also prevented them from casting any magic anytime soon. They discovered that the mage killer Aminos, who had been roaming outside, had somehow disappeared when they were not paying attention to him. At this moment, everyone's heart was filled with dejection, and no one knew who would be doomed next. They had no idea when Aminos would kill them silently, but they knew that the legendary mage killer would only require 1/10 of a second to kill. Although Aminos could not assassinate everyone within a short period of time, it was the uncertainty that plunged everyone into endless fear. Even the few legendary mages wouldn't be able to immediately cast a low-level magic shield to protect themselves within this 1/10 of a second. However, just as the elemental shield dissipated and Rosen and the other legendary mages cast magic shields on themselves, the Helios scepter in Lin Li's hands emitted a dazzling light. It was not a defensive spell, but a powerful offensive spell, Meteor Shower. The target of the offensive spell turned out to be Lin Li himself. While countless fireballs bombarded them with a loud roar, Lin Li did not waver nor stop, and instead immediately launched his own light and darkness domain, which blasted against his own flames. Lin Li's almost self-abusing behavior made everyone confused, but the shriek that sounded in the sky a short while later made their eyes widen in shock. However, Lin Li did not stop. Instead, he condensed his light and darkness sword and swung it forcefully in the direction of the shriek. A burning man emerged from the meteor shower and landed on the ground in front of him. He didn't extinguish the flames on his body immediately, and instead said to Lin Li in a hoarse voice, "How did you know that my target is you?" Lin Li stepped out of the crowd and walked towards the man in flames who was clearly already on the verge of dying. He smiled and said, "I'm the youngest one here, so I'd naturally seem like a pushover." Rosen was still getting ready to reprimand Lin Li, but when he walked towards the edge, he immediately stopped because he heard Lin Li's answer. He wondered if Aminos was pleased with Lin Li's answer. As the flame gradually diminished, Aminos' body was charred, and no one could tell if he was dead or not. Of course, age was just the reason that Lin Li had come up with randomly. In fact, from the moment that he'd recognized Aminos to be the mage killer, Lin Li had already begun doing his best to hatch a plan and perform well for this moment. When Rosen called out Aminos' name, Lin Li began to work hard at recalling all the information about Aminos, and also gained a general understanding of the characteristics of the legendary mage killer. For example, in order to sneak away, Aminos couldn't cast any defensive spells or use any magical equipment with protective effects. In addition, most of the magic he learned was focused on stealth and assassination. He enjoyed using low-level single-target magic spells, and disliked learning powerful legendary magic and so on. Hence, Lin Li began to perform. He first obtained the temporary commanding right from Aldwin, and then tried to behave as a young mage who was a great commander. That was actually not difficult. As long as the mages obeyed him, it would be enough to show how good he was at commanding. Next, Lin Li suppressed his own magical waves. Although his strength was at the peak of level 23 and it was hard for him to disguise himself as an apprentice in magic, Lin Li believed that Aminos wouldn't use his mental strength to sense his power, because that would expose his tracks. If the fluctuations in his mental strength were captured, Aminos would immediately become the target of the mages. While suppressing the magical waves, Lin Li put up his magical shield and avoided casting other high-level magic. When casting the magical shield, he also behaved like a mage, between level 10 and level 15. That required good acting chops, as an over-exaggeration would arouse Aminos' suspicion. Fortunately, Lin Li did not take too long to advance from an apprentice to the way he was now, hence, he could still remember how he behaved when he was an archmage. Through the performance, Lin Li portrayed himself as an extremely important commander of team, and at same time, pretended to be weak. At first glance, he did seem like a pushover. If Lin Li were the mage killer, he would definitely choose himself as the first target of assassination as well. In the eyes of the mage killer Aminos, Lin Li was just like a bait that he could not refuse, but that did not mean that he would take it desperately without caring about anything else. Hence, Lin Li needed to give Aminos an opportunity that would allow him to take the bait without any worries. The mage's failure to cast the spell, what happened yesterday, had undoubtedly caused a crack in the team of mages. Although they were the elites of the elites, and might not let the crack affect their tacit cooperation during the battle, they still could not solve their psychological issues easily. The cracks would definitely cause their joint spell to fail, and Aminos definitely wouldn't miss the chance to attack. Finally, all of Lin Li's efforts were not in vain. The legendary mage killer, who had instilled fear within countless people during the Dark Age, truly became history after more than 1,300 years. Looking at the flames that were dying out and the scorched corpse, the mages who had escaped from the verge of death could not help but gasp in shock that they had been suppressing for a long time after a moment of disbelief. The mage killer Aminos. who was one of the Butcher Osric's sharpest weapons and a legendary figure of the Dark Age, actually died like this. Haha, Felix, I didn't expect this mage killer to die in your hands. Anduin walked towards Lin Li smilingly and patted his shoulder. The terrifying thing about assassins was the fact that no one would know whom they were targeting until the latter was on the brink of death. However, once the conditions had been determined, the assassin would only become an idiot no matter how sharp and shrewd they might be. Seeing that the mage killer had died, Anduin, Aldwin, and the rest could basically tell what Lin Li's plan was since they were not fools. Rosen glanced back and forth at the mage killer's corpse and Lin Li several times, and had to admit that Lin Li's method of making aminos take the bait was really not something that ordinary people could do, especially with a menacing mage killer. Felix, although you were lucky enough to have your plan succeed, you put everyone in danger just now. I hope that if this happens again, you'll explain your plan to everyone. Otherwise, others would be in danger while you're in a safe position. Don't you think that's being unfair to them? Rosen chided indignantly. Clearly, Lin Li had already gained some prestige amongst the mages through killing the mage killer. That was definitely not something that Rosen wanted to see. Lin Li stopped Anduin, who was going to flare up, and turned to look at Rosen, smilingly. Thank you for the reminder, Master Rosen. I almost forgot that I have to thank you for your help in allowing me to successfully killing the mage killer. If it weren't for your help, I'm afraid it might not have been easy for the mages to fail in casting a joint without looking like they were pretending. Lin Li's words made Rosen's face grow extremely sullen, while the other mages appeared rather guilty. Everyone knew that if it weren't for Rosen's behavior yesterday, the mages wouldn't have slipped up. The failure of the joint casting had caused the mages to lose their battle power. At the thought of this, Aldwin glowered at Rosen angrily. Rosen cocked his head towards the side, turning as pale as a sheet. After all, it was impossible for Aldwin to fall out with Rosen, hence, he had no choice but to suppress his anger and begin to count the number of casualties amongst the mages. However, it still hurt Aldwin, who now felt like his heart was bleeding. Under the assassination of the mage killer, the mages actually lost 17 archmages who were all elites of the Alana Guild of Magic. Every archmage had been nurtured painstakingly by him. However, Aldwin also knew that they were in Osric's mausoleum, and the team had encountered a mage killer who had already been famous since the Dark Age. Actually, if it weren't for Lin Li, none of them would have survived. The only thing to rejoice about after the mage killer aminos appeared was that it implied that Osric's mausoleum was probably not too far away. At this time, the sky was completely dark. Although there were some conflicts among the leaders, there was no room for mistakes when exploring Osric's mausoleum. They had no choice but to sit back together with sullen expressions and discuss their next move. However, just when Rosen and Antoine were arguing whether they should continue to move forward or rest overnight on the spot, a sudden tremor came from the ground underneath, and gradually became stronger. There seemed to be a giant object approaching them rapidly. Soon, the mage acting as sentry issued a warning signal, and everyone immediately got up and stayed alert. The ground began to shook violently, and a huge figure began to shine brightly as if it were tearing the night sky apart. With rumbling footsteps, it quickly approached everyone, and when that huge figure appeared, they all could not help but gasp in horror. The Alchemy Colossus. It was a massive alchemy colossus. Damn it, it's a Titan-level alchemy colossus. It definitely is Titan level. Lin Li looked at the huge body of the alchemy colossus opposite, and was filled with horror that he could not describe. Others might not know it, and simply think that the size of the alchemy colossus was just for show. After all, the ultimate form of the Titan-level alchemy colossus did not exist in this era, and only remained in unrealistic legends. In fact, there was no relevant data that could be verified. However, when Lin Li saw the alchemy colossus, he immediately thought of the skeleton of the Titan he had obtained in the Higa mountain range. Although he had never seen an actual, alchemy colossus in real life, he firmly believed that the alchemy colossus before him now was the ultimate form of the Titan-level alchemy colossus. Even with the experience that he had in the endless world, the alchemy colossus in Lin Li's memory had always only existed in legends. Although the Titan alchemy colossus was not really a work of an alchemy guru, it would still be a far-fetched dream for an ordinary alchemist to build it. If someone could build a real Titan-level alchemy colossus, it would be no exaggeration to say that they had reached the peak of an alchemy guru. They would just be one step away from a divine smith. Moreover, building a real Titan-level alchemy colossus would require countless materials, manpower, resources, and the production of countless alchemy arrays, as well as an unimaginable amount of energy. Ordinary alchemists would never be able to do it. It was said that even during the peak of the development of alchemy, the High Elves, who had a large number of alchemists, were never able to create the Titan-level alchemy colossuses which only existed on the drawing board. As for Lin Li, he had never dreamed of creating a Titan-level alchemy colossus, despite knowing how powerful it was. Titan-level alchemy colossus? Anduin shrieked in shock when he heard Lin Li's exclamation, and turned to look at him in disbelief. Lin Li nodded bitterly with a wry smile, and said, "I can't think of any other possibility besides the Titan-level alchemy colossus. Believe me, this thing is definitely more terrifying than legends have it. One, as opposed to inferior replica." Lin Li's statement was not exaggerated at all. Although the Titan-level alchemy colossus was created artificially, its power couldn't reach the sanctuary realm, yet it had level 24 abilities. Thanks to the countless powerful alchemy arrays, the fighting power of the Titan-level alchemy colossus was nearing the sanctuary realm. It was said that in the Dark Age, even the High Elves who had obtained countless wealth only possessed 3 Titan-level alchemy colossuses. However, during the battle to expel and destroy the prehistoric magical beasts, the 3 Titan-level alchemy colossuses seem to have played an extremely important role as they destroyed countless powerful prehistoric magical beasts. The magical beasts that fled and hid in the barren lands of Amril after the prehistoric times did not have the advantage of being in groups, but there had been quite a few that reached the sanctuary realm. However, when faced with the Titan-level alchemy colossus, the tyrannical prehistoric magical beasts could not even leave the slightest scar on them. The sky castles were called invincible, while the 3 Titan-level alchemy colossuses were called the undefeated gods of war. Even the descendants of the ancient Wyrms could only become prey to the Titan-level alchemy colossuses. It's Angelano. I heard that one of Osric's 3 greatest weapons is a mysterious and powerful alchemy colossus. Since Aminos has appeared, this big guy is probably Angelano. Anduin gritted his teeth angrily. Although he had long predicted that they would very likely meet the 3 guardians after entering Osric's mausoleum, they had always thought that Angelano should be the weakest of the 3. However, if Angelano was a Titan-level alchemy colossus like Lin Li mentioned, he might just be the toughest to deal with. In the legends of the High Lord Osric, there was no description of the origin of Angelano who controlled the Titan-level alchemy colossus. It seemed that Angelano's origin had been very mysterious even during the Dark Age. The only description of his origin in legends was that he had been following Osric since a long time, even before Osric succeeded the position passed down in his family. There were too many legends and rumors about Angelano's strength, and this alchemy colossus seemed to be present in every detail about Osric's long life that was recorded in history. All enemies who hindered Osric would be ruthlessly ripped apart by the alchemy colossus, be it the tyrannical prehistoric magical beasts, the rebellion forces, the arrogant and haughty lords of the abyss, or the high elves that went against Osric. Lin Li initially had some doubts about the strength of the alchemy colossus when he first heard the legend about Angelano. However, it was now confirmed that Angelano was actually controlling a Titan-level alchemy colossus. Hence, everything seemed reasonable now. Even though the Titan-level alchemy colossus was not a real Titan, its formidable power was enough for it to live up to its reputation from the Dark Age. In fact, its power surpassed the strong team of mages. The conversation between Lin Li and Anduin was rather soft as they kept their volume low. Hence, no one heard them. It was mainly because they were afraid of affecting the morale of the mages. After all, they had just experienced the attack of the mage killer Aminos, and even though they were elites, it was difficult to keep calm. However, it wasn't a bad thing that the mage killer Aminos had died. Otherwise, his assassination and the alchemy Colossus Angelano's head-on attacks would definitely stop the mages from continuing. Even Angelano has appeared, so Angelano looked at the alchemy Colossus worriedly. 2 of Osric's 3 killers had already appeared, and the third one was Amateur, who was said to be the strongest of the 3 according to legends. Where would Amateur be? Wait. Unfortunately, not everyone liked fighting solo like Aminos did. Although he could clearly wipe out the invading enemies in one go, he still spread his power apart and destroyed the enemies one by one. Not long after the alchemy Colossus Angelano appeared, a team of mages followed close behind him and gradually appeared. When the team showed up in front of Lin Li and the rest, everyone was puzzled. In their eyes, the team beside the alchemy Colossus seemed to contain members in the form of ghosts and liches. Clearly, it was an army of undead creatures. However, they could not detect any undead creatures or undead aura. All that was emitted was pure magical waves, just like from mages. However, compared to the Death Knights with divine power, the team of undead creatures was in fact not that incredible. Behind the team of undead creatures was a lich wrapped in a black robe who was exuding powerful magical waves and riding a nightmare beast shrouded in golden flames. He was slowly moving towards Lin Li and the rest. Indeed, it's Amateur, the commander of Osric's magic legion, Anduin said with a sullen expression. None of them would be pleased to see Osric's other 2 killers. Moreover, the Lich Amateur was said to be the strongest of the 3 and the commander of Osric's magic legion. Legend had it that during the Dark Age, Amateur was directly involved in the tragic massacres launched by the High Lord Osric. Under the command of Amateur, the magic legion was absolutely invincible as they destroyed the rebellion forces one after another. They even once barged into the endless abyss and caused the demon lords to grow distressed. Amateur not only had the ability to command, his personal strength and abilities were not to be belittled either. It was said that when Amateur disappeared, his powers were already near the sanctuary realm. Now that the Dark Age had already been over for more than 1,300 years, it was hard to imagine how strong he had become. They even came out together. Did those undead creatures used to belong to the Magic Legion? Aldwin looked at the team and thought that they would definitely be his opponents if the battle were to begin. How much major damage would there be? As the enemies approached, Aldwin was able to see the number of the undead creatures clearly. Although they were not as strong as the legendary Magic Legion of Osric, they would definitely be formidable if they still had the fighting power that they had back then. It was said that every mage in the Magic Legion back then was an archmage, and some had even entered the legendary realm. It was said that Osric had once directed the Magic Legion into the endless abyss and led them through the floors, which they all plundered. Legend had it that there were plenty of demon lords who even formed a demon alliance for the first time, and gathered hundreds of thousands of abyssal demons. However, even then, they could not stop Magic Legion. None of the hundreds of thousands of abyssal demons escaped, and the powerful demon lords were either killed or captured. Even after the Magic Legion left the endless abyss, no demons appeared in the abyss for a long time. It was only many years after Osric's death that the abyss gradually regained some of its vitality. However, new demon lords were never born. Aldwin, this is Osric's mausoleum, and it is impossible to take the things here without getting hurt. We must bear the consequences, Rosen said while looking in front, overwhelmed with regret. Had he known earlier that there would be such a strong enemy, he would have saved the chance for summoning the WYRMS for now. Aldwin did not respond, and simply glanced at Rosen coldly while cursing in his head. Damn it, you obviously don't feel the pinch, because you weren't the one who groomed and nurtured them. God knows how many juniors I'll have left after this exploration. No matter how many benefits I reap here, the losses cannot be compensated for so easily. As the Titan-level alchemy Colossus Angelano and the Lich Amateur appeared together with the 200-odd undead creatures, a huge cemetery was also vaguely exposed. The group had exited from the cemetery. That should be the real Osric's mausoleum, Rosen said with a little excitement in his eyes. According to the information obtained, Aminos, Angelano, and Amatir, the sharpest killers belonging to Osric, were present to protect Osric's mausoleum and allow him to rest peacefully without getting disturbed. Since the guardians had appeared, the item that they were guarding was definitely near. Well, even if that is the real mausoleum, we have to pass this obstacle first. Otherwise, this will become our grave, Anduin jibed, not taking his eyes off the enemy at all. The staff that he was holding tightly was already glistening. It would be impossible not to be nervous now that they were facing the enemies who were approaching them. Even Anduin and Rosen, the level 23 legendary mages, could not help but break out into sweat. As for Alduin's mages, they all knew that the team of undead was their enemy, and they all turned austere, though they were remaining still. Some even swallowed their saliva nervously. How dare these lowly humans disturb Master's sleep? Get ready to suffer Angelano's wrath. A dull and heavy voice came out of the huge alchemy colossus, sounding like thunder. Next, the alchemy colossus took a huge step out and rushed towards Lin Li's team while causing the ground to quake. Every step that the alchemy colossus took caused a thick layer of dust to surge upwards and outwards like tides. It made it difficult for them to just stand still. Leave that big guy to me. Lin Li took out the summoning lamp and summoned the crimson dragon that was sealed in it, after which he rode on its back and flew towards the alchemy colossus. In Lin Li's opinion, his choice should be the most apt for the current situation. After all, no one in the crowd knew more about the alchemy colossuses than he did. Of course, he did not think that he would be able to deal with the Titan-level alchemy colossus and get rid of it. However, the Lich Amatir seemed to be much more dangerous to him than the Titan-level alchemy colossus. In terms of magic, although Lin Li, Anduin, and Rosen were all level 23 legendary mages, there was still a certain difference in their combat experience. The Lich riding the nightmare was clearly a master of magic. Hence, Lin Li felt that it would be better to leave the Lich to Anduin and Rosen. As for the team of undead that used to be the Magic Legion, Lin Li hoped that Alduin would be able to hold them back. Although there had been some problems between the mages, Alduin felt that he could find a temporary solution. Watching Lin Li ride the Crimson Dragon while moving towards the Alchemy Colossus, the others did not say much. Anduin believed that Lin Li would not make a decision that he was unsure of, and Rosen also felt that the Alchemy Colossus seemed to be tougher to deal with. The two men glanced at each other, each holding a staff and rushing towards the Lich Amatir. Although the relationship between Anduin and Rosen was strained, everyone knew that the most important thing to do now was to unite and fight the enemies together, otherwise, no one would be safe. The team of mages led by Alduin had no choice but to form a tighter defense formation and slowly approach the undead. I didn't expect that scheming guy Aminos to be killed by you lowly human beings. Although I hate that guy, he was still one of us. I will avenge him, starting with you, the Titan-level alchemy colossus mused, and extended his arms towards Lin Li. Thank you for watching Mystic Realms Recap. Please like, share and subscribe. Have a great day.